Welcome to Relaxing Subjects. Settle in wherever you are. You don't have to do anything now, but let the weight of the day begin to leave you, one small part at a time. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they've been holding themselves. Let your jaw soften. Let the breath you're taking right now be a little slower than the one before it, and the next one slower still. There is nothing to figure out tonight. There is nowhere else you need to be. There is only this quiet room, wherever it is, and this voice, and a very old story that has been waiting a long time to be told to you gently. Tonight we are going to spend some time with a book. It's called the Vimalakīrti Nirdeśa Sūtra, which is a long name. So let me set it down softly, and we'll pick up the pieces slowly, one at a time, the way you'd unwrap something fragile you'd been given. Nirdeśa simply means the teaching, or the explanation. So the whole title just means the teaching of a man named Vimalakirti. That's all, the teaching of Vimalakirti. And by the end of tonight you'll feel like you've met him, this man, even though he lived, if he lived at all, and we'll get to that a very, very long time ago. You do not need to know anything about Buddhism to listen to this. Truly, nothing. If you have never read a single line of any scripture in your life, you are in exactly the right place. Every strange word, every name that sounds like it has too many syllables, I'll set down beside you in plain language. The way you'd explain something to a friend over a cup of tea. There is no test at the end. There is no belief you have to hold. You can disagree with every word of it and still fall asleep perfectly well, held by the sound of an old story doing what old stories do. This book is old. Most of the people who study these things think it was written down around the year 100. In the 1st or 2nd century in India, in a language called Sanskrit, by someone whose name we will never know. That's roughly 2,000 years ago. Think of that for a moment, but gently, don't strain at it. 2,000 years. Longer than most of the buildings you've ever stood in. Longer than most of the words in the language you're hearing now have existed. And through all that time, from hand to hand, from voice to voice, across mountains and empires and languages, this small, strange, funny book made its way until tonight it arrives here, in the dark, with you. Before we go any further, a small, warm thing. If you feel like it, and only if you feel like it, you might leave a note somewhere later saying what time it is where you are, and what corner of the world you're listening from. There's something lovely about that, imagining all the different windows, all the different hours, all the people lying in the dark in different countries, meeting the same quiet story at the same slow pace. Some of you it's the middle of the night for, some of you the rain is coming down. Some of you it's very early and still dark and you can't sleep and you'd like to. Wherever you are, whatever hour it is where you're lying, this is for you. So take a slow, deep breath now. In, gently, through the nose. And let it go slowly, with a little sound if you like. Let yourself settle in. Thank you for being here with me tonight. Let us begin. Now here is the thing about this book that almost nobody tells you, and it's the reason I wanted to read it to you tonight rather than some other one. Because when people describe the Vimalakīrti Sūtra, they almost always reach straight for the most famous, most serious, most philosophical moment in it, a moment of great silence at the end, which we will get to, slowly, much later. And they talk about it in hushed, important tones, the way people talk about a painting in a museum when they want you to think they understand it. And that's fine. It is a beautiful moment. But it means that hardly anyone ever tells you the other thing about this book, the thing that surprised me the first time I read it straight through, from the beginning, in order, without skipping ahead to the famous part. The other thing is this. This ancient, revered, sacred scripture, one of the most important books in an entire branch of Buddhism, is, in large part, genuinely funny. Quietly, warmly, almost mischievously funny. And nobody warns you. Let me tell you how the funny part works, because it's the whole spine of the story, and it's the part I want you to drift off inside of tonight. There is a chapter, a long chapter, near the beginning, in which the Buddha himself, the great teacher at the center of all of this, keeps trying to send someone on a simple errand. Just a visit. Someone in the city is ill, and the Buddha, kind as ever, wants one of his followers to go and sit with the sick man and ask how he's doing. That's all. It's the sort of thing you'd ask anyone. Go check on so-and-so, he's not well, go see how he is. And one after another, the greatest, wisest, most accomplished students the Buddha has, the absolute cream, the ones whose names are remembered and honored 2,000 years later, one after another, they all say no. They all find a reason not to go. And every single one of them says no for the same buried, embarrassing reason, which comes out slowly, one confession at a time, as the chapter unfolds. Each of them, it turns out, has met this sick man before, and each of them, at that earlier meeting, got quietly and thoroughly out-argued by him. Corrected, gently taken apart, left standing there with nothing to say. And so now, when the Buddha says, "Would you go and visit him?" each one of them remembers that day, and winces, and says, "Oh no, not me, please, I am not worthy to go and ask after that man. Send someone else." That's the joke. And it is a joke, once you see it. An entire chapter of a sacred book is just the most impressive spiritual all-stars you can imagine, one by one, inventing reasons to get out of running a simple errand, because they're all a little afraid of the same sick man in the same house across town. It reads almost like the moment in an office when someone asks who wants to go talk to the difficult client. And everyone very suddenly becomes extremely interested in their own paperwork. That's it. That's the shape of it. The Buddha asks and asks and asks, and one legendary disciple after another very politely finds a way to say, "You know what, I'd really rather not." I love that. I have loved it for a long time. It's such a human thing to find sitting there in the middle of scripture. This warm little comedy of avoidance, and it makes the whole enormous ancient thing feel suddenly close, suddenly recognizable, suddenly like it was written by people who knew exactly what people are like. But underneath the joke, and this is the part I really want to leave with you tonight, the part worth lying awake a little longer for. Underneath the joke, there's something quiet and steadying. Because the sick man they're all a little afraid of, the man who out-argued every one of them. The man whose understanding the story quietly places above all these great monks. This man is not a monk himself. He never gave anything up. He isn't a hermit on a mountain. He isn't someone who walked away from the world to go find the truth in a cave. He's a householder, an ordinary one, in the outward shape of his life. He has a wife. He has a family. He has a house, a real house, with rooms and servants and a door people knock on. He has money. The story is quite clear that he's wealthy. He has a business, dealings, a place in the ordinary bustling commerce of his city. He goes out into the streets. He is, on the surface, exactly the kind of person who, if you asked him, might say, "Oh, this deep contemplative business isn't really for someone like me. I've got too much going on. I'm too far inside a normal life for any of that." And the whole book is here to tell you, very gently, that that was never true. Not for him. And the story seems to lean toward you as it says it, not for you either. His name is Vimalakirti. Let me give you the name slowly, because you'll be hearing it all night, and I'd like it to feel comfortable in your ear. Vimalakirti. In the old Chinese versions of the story, where it travelled next after India, they called him Weimoji, and often just shortened it warmly to Weimo. The name means something lovely. Vimala means stainless, spotless, undefiled, clean the way still water is clean, the way fresh snow is clean, before anyone has walked on it. And Kruti means fame, or reputation, or renown. So his name means, roughly, stainless reputation. The man of undefiled fame. A spotless name. And there's a small, sweet irony folded into that name, once you know how he lived. Because this man with the spotless reputation did not keep himself apart from the messy parts of ordinary life in order to stay clean. Just the opposite. The story tells us he went everywhere. He walked into the places a careful, image-conscious holy man would avoid. He went into the gambling houses. He went into the taverns where people drink and get loud and forget themselves. He even went, the text says plainly, into the brothels. He moved through all the ordinary, unglamorous, appetite-driven corners of the city, the places the respectable would cross the street to avoid. Now, and here's the tender part, he didn't go to those places to lose himself in them. He went to be with the people there. He went because those were people too, people no one else would sit with, and he wanted to reach them where they were. There's a word for this in the tradition, and I'll give it to you softly, and then mostly set it aside, upya. Say it like Upāli. It means skillful means. It means meeting people exactly where they are, instead of demanding they come to you. It means that a kind teacher will pick up whatever tool is nearest and use it to help, will sit in the tavern with the person in the tavern, will speak to the gambler in the language of the gambling house, will be, for each person, whatever will actually reach them. So the spotless one was spotless not because he stayed away from the ordinary muddle of human life, but because he could walk straight through the middle of it and stay kind, stay clear, stay himself. His cleanliness wasn't the cleanliness of a man who never touches anything. It was the cleanliness of still water that things pass through without staining. And that's a very different and much more comforting idea to fall asleep on, that you don't have to withdraw from your life, from your work, from your messy ordinary days, to be near this kind of peace. That the peace, if it's real, is the kind you can carry right into the middle of everything. He lived in a city called Vaiśālī. It was a real place, a real city in ancient India, the capital of a group of clans called the Likavis. You don't need to hold on to that. It's just to say this wasn't nowhere. This was a bustling, prosperous city with markets and gates and crowds, the kind of place where a wealthy man with a good name and a busy life would be known, would be greeted in the street, would have a reputation to have. Picture, if it helps you drift, a warm and crowded old city under a wide evening sky. Dust in the low light. The smell of cooking. Voices calling to one another as the day winds down. Somewhere in it, a large house, and in that house, a man. I should say, gently and honestly, because I'd rather you trust me. There's no historical proof that a real man named Vimalakirti ever actually lived. Scholars don't think we can point to a real person and say, there, that was him. He's a figure in a story, a character, the way a character in any great old tale is. But here's the thing about that, and it's the reason it doesn't spoil anything. The story never really depended on him having been a man you could have shaken hands with. He's true the way the people in the very best stories are true, true to something real about how a life can be lived, whether or not he ever drew a breath. So when I tell you what he did and what he said, hold it the way you'd hold any deep old story, not as a newspaper report, but as something carrying a truth in the shape of a person. The tradition it comes from, that's real. The city, the ideas, the long line of people who read this and were comforted by it, all real. The man himself is a lamp lit to show you something, and the light is what matters. Now, the whole story, the entire long unfolding thing, turns on one strange fact, and I want to lay it down carefully because it's easy to hear it the wrong way at first. Vimalakirti gets sick. But, and this is the strange and beautiful part, he gets sick on purpose. He lets himself become ill deliberately as another one of those skillful means, another tool picked up to help. Because he knows something very simple about people, something you probably know too if you think about it. People come to visit the sick. When someone is ill, others come. They come to sit by the bed. They come to ask how you're feeling, to bring something, to keep you company. Illness draws people near in a way that health doesn't. A well man in a busy city, people leave him to his business. A sick man in his bed, people come. So he becomes ill, this householder, on purpose, so that all the people of the city, and eventually the great and the wise as well, will come to his bedside. And when they come, he'll have them there, close and quiet, and paying attention in the way people only really pay attention at a sickbed, and he can talk with them, and reach them, one by one, in that soft and lowered voice you use in a sick room. And when he's asked about his illness, where does it come from, why are you sick, he gives an answer that I have carried with me for a long time, and I'd like to give it to you now to carry into your sleep. He says, in his own words, because all sentient beings are sick, I am sick. And he says, when they are cured, my sickness will be cured. Sit with that a moment, softly, because all beings are sick, I am sick. When they are healed, I will be healed. His illness, the story tells us, doesn't come from ordinary suffering the way most of ours does, from a cold court, a body wearing down, bad luck of the flesh. It comes from something the tradition calls great compassion. It's the ache you feel because someone you love is hurting. You know this feeling. If you have ever loved anyone at all, you know it. When your child is sick, you feel sick. When someone you love is in pain, some part of you is in pain with them, and you can't fully rest until they can. That's the illness he's describing. Not a defeat. Not a punishment. Not something that went wrong in him. It's the natural condition of a heart that has become so wide that other people's suffering lands inside it as if it were its own. He is sick because the world is sick, and he has stopped being able to hold himself separate from the world. I find that so gentle a thing to fall asleep on, that there's a kind of illness that isn't a failure, that's just love, feeling everything. That the ache you sometimes carry for the people you love, the heaviness of caring, isn't a flaw in you or a weight you're carrying wrong. It might be the most awake thing about you. So, the sick householder is in his bed, in his house, in the crowded city of Vale, having become ill on purpose out of a love so wide it reaches everyone. And now the story turns to the Buddha. At this point in the tale, the Buddha is staying just outside the city, in a garden. It's called the Mrapple Garden, sometimes just the Amra Garden, or the Mango Grove, Amrapali. Picture that too, if you like, as you settle deeper. A grove of mango trees outside the city walls, broad leaves, dappled shade. The great teacher and his many followers gathered there in the green quiet, the city humming faintly in the distance. A good place to rest, a good place to be. And word reaches this gathering that Vimalakirti, the well-known householder, is unwell. And the Buddha, in his kindness, looks around at his followers and does the most ordinary, human, neighbourly thing. He decides someone should go and visit the sick man, someone should go and sit with him and ask, on everyone's behalf, how he is doing. And here begins the comedy. Slowly, one refusal at a time, the Buddha will turn to one of his very greatest disciples and say, in effect, You go. Go and ask after Vimalakirti's health for me. And that disciple, that legendary figure, will lower his eyes and very politely explain why he, of all people, is really not the right one to send. The first one the Buddha asks is a man named Śāriputra. Śāriputra. And you should know who Śāriputra is, because it makes the whole thing funnier and sweeter. Śāriputra was famous, genuinely, deeply famous within this world, for being the wisest of all the Buddha's disciples. When people listed the great students and what each was best at, Śāriputra was the one they named first for wisdom. Foremost in wisdom, they called him. The sharpest mind in the room, any room. If you were going to send anyone to hold his own in a conversation with a clever man, you'd send Śāriputra. He's the obvious choice. He's the top of the class. And the Buddha says, Śāriputra, you go and ask after Vimalakirti. And Śāriputra says, oh, please, not me. I am not equal to it. And then, slowly, a little embarrassed, he explains why. He tells the story of the last time he met this man. It happened, he says, when he was sitting quietly in meditation under a tree in the forest. Just sitting, being still. Doing exactly the thing a devoted seeker is supposed to do, finding a quiet spot, folding the body into stillness, settling the mind. The picture-perfect image of spiritual practice. A man under a tree, at peace, eyes lowered, doing it right. And Vimalakirti came along and found him there, and instead of tiptoeing past out of respect, or nodding in approval, good, keep it up, this householder stopped and looked at the great wise Śāriputra sitting so beautifully under his tree, and gently, warmly, took the whole thing apart. Because, and here's the tender turn of the knife, Vimalakirti said, in effect, this sitting, this quiet posture under a tree, this isn't really the deep thing you think it is. True stillness, he said, real meditation, isn't a matter of arranging the body a certain way in a quiet spot. You can hold that posture perfectly and still be miles from the real thing. And you can be nowhere near a meditation cushion, out in the middle of the loud, ordinary world, doing the dishes, walking to work, sitting up with a sick child, and be right in the middle of the real thing. The word the tradition uses for the practice Śāriputra was doing is dhyana. It just means meditation, absorption, quiet inner stillness. It's actually the root of the word that much later, travelling east, became Zen. And what Vimalakirti was saying to Śāriputra, gently under that tree, was something like, don't mistake the outer shape of stillness for stillness itself. The true sitting isn't about showing a calm body and a calm mind to the world at all. It's something quieter and deeper than any posture. Something you can't put on display, something that doesn't need a tree or a forest or a special position or even quiet. He described a kind of stillness so complete that it doesn't even announce itself as stillness. A peace that isn't performing peace. And Śāriputra, the wisest of them all, sitting there so correctly under his tree, he had nothing to say. This clever, celebrated man, taken gently apart by a householder who'd wandered in from the city, he couldn't answer. And so, he tells the Buddha now, "That's why, please, I really am not the one to send back to that man's house. Send someone else. Do you hear the shape of it? Do you feel it? The wisest one, undone, quietly, kindly, by the man with the house and the business and the family." And so he begs off, and the Buddha, patient as the evening, simply turns to the next one. The next one the Buddha asks is called Mahmoudgaliyana. "That's a long one. Let me give it to you slowly, and you can let it wash over you. You don't have to keep it. Mahmoudgaliyana. He's often just called by a shorter form, but I'll keep his full name soft in the background. He was famous too, in his own way, and for something quite different from Śāriputra. If Śāriputra was foremost in wisdom, Mahmoudgaliyana was foremost in what the tradition calls supernatural powers. The one, in the old stories, who could do wondrous things, travel in extraordinary ways, see and reach in ways ordinary people couldn't. The powerful one, the impressive one. And the Buddha says, you go and ask after the sick householder. And he too lowers his eyes and says, not me either. Please, and he tells his own story of the day he met Vimalakirti. He had been in the city, he says, teaching. He'd been giving the teaching, the Dharma, they call it, which just means the truth, the teaching, the way things really are, to a gathering of ordinary townspeople, lay people, the men and women of Vale, standing there, explaining the deep things to the everyday crowd. Again, exactly the sort of good and worthy thing a great disciple is supposed to be doing, sharing the teaching with the people. Who could object to that? And Vimalakirti came by and found him teaching and stopped him, gently, always gently, and suggested that he wasn't quite teaching it the way it deserved to be taught. He was making it, Vimalakirti hinted, a little too solid, a little too crude, a little too much like handing out a simple object. Because, and here we brush up against one of the deep, strange ideas at the heart of all of this, and I'll give it to you softly. The way you'd show a child a stone in your palm and then close your hand again, Vimalakirti told him that the teaching, the real Dharma, has no beings in it, that when you look really closely right down at the bottom of things, there isn't a solid, separate, permanent little someone standing behind each face. There's no fixed, unchanging self sitting at the center of a person like a stone at the center of a fruit. And so, he said, when you preach the truth, you can't preach it as though you're just one solid, separate person handing a fixed thing to a crowd of other solid, separate persons. The truth is subtler than that. It's beyond being fully caught in words at all. You were, he said kindly, teaching something boundless as though it were a small, hard object you could pass hand to hand. Now don't strain at that idea tonight. You don't have to understand it or agree with it or hold it. I only want you to feel the shape of the moment, the same shape as before, the great accomplished disciple, doing the right and worthy thing, stopped mid-stride by the householder and shown gently that there was something deeper he'd walked right past. And he too had nothing to say. And he too now begs the Buddha, please send someone else. I am not the one to sit at that man's bedside and trade words with him. And the Buddha, unhurried, turns to the next. And this is how the whole long chapter goes, and where we'll pick up when we continue. One after another, the greatest of the great, each asked to go. Each remembering his own quiet undoing at the hands of the sick householder, each softly, a little sheepishly, saying, not me, please, not me. And the beautiful thing, the thing to carry down into sleep, is what it all keeps pointing at, underneath the gentle comedy of all these legends finding reasons to stay home. It keeps pointing at the man in the bed, the one none of them can quite face, the one who never left his ordinary life, his house, his family, his business, his crowded human city, and who understood all along, in the middle of all of it, more deeply than any of them. So let us pause here for a moment together. There's no hurry at all. Take a slow, deep breath, in through the nose, and let it go, slowly. Feel how the room has quieted around you. Feel the weight of your body against whatever is holding you, the bed, the pillow, the blanket. Notice, if you can, that some small part of you has already begun to soften and let go. Some part that was still holding on when we started. Let it. There is nothing you need to carry into what comes next. And when you're ready, unhurried, still resting, we'll go on together, because the Buddha has only just begun to ask, and there are so many more still waiting, one by one, to find their own gentle reason to say no. Mahākāśyapa had a reputation. Everyone who knew the order knew it. He was the one who had chosen the hardest path, the coldest road, the roughest robe. He slept under trees, not under roofs. He ate what was given, and nothing more. He had been practicing austerity since before many of the younger monks had even thought to look for a teacher, and his dedication was, by any measure, extraordinary. The Buddha himself praised him. Among all the disciplines, he was the one who seemed to have turned privation into a kind of art. And on the particular morning he remembered, he had been walking through Vale with his begging bowl, moving slowly as he always moved, through the lanes and alleys of the city. He had made a quiet decision, and it was a decision that came from kindness, or at least from what he had understood kindness to mean. He was choosing to stop only at the doors of poor families. The very poor, the ones who had almost nothing to give. Because, he reasoned, those families needed the merit of offering more than the wealthy ones did. The rich could buy merit in 100 other ways. The poor had fewer doors open to them. So he would be one of those doors. He thought of it as a kind of gift, a deliberate routing of the opportunity toward the ones who needed it most. He arrived at Vimalakirti's door, and Vimalakirti, sick in his bed, looked at him with what might have been affection, and said something that took the ground out from under everything Mahākāśyapa had decided. He said, "If you truly want to give the gift of merit, you cannot select who receives it. The moment you choose this family and not that one, this door and not the other, you have already introduced a discrimination. You have said, I see a difference between the poor and the rich that matters more than equality. But the Dharma, he said, rests on exactly the opposite understanding. All beings, in their essential nature, are the same. The hungry ghost and the king sitting down to dinner, the widow with her single grain of rice, and the merchant with his storehouses full, in reality, there is no hierarchy. To beg only from the poor is to reinforce the idea that poverty is a special category, that those people are different, that the world really does divide the way you've divided it. Beg, he said, from everyone. Move through the city without a preference. Eat from a jeweled bowl and a cracked one with the same gratitude. That is equality. That is what the Dharma means when it says there are no beings who are above or below. Mahākāśyapa stood there, holding his bowl. He had thought he was doing something beautiful. He had thought his discrimination was a compassionate one, and Vimalakirti had simply, gently, held a mirror up to it and let him see. He went on his way. But the conversation stayed. These things stay. The ones that reach you at the level where your certainties live, where you thought you already understood, those are the ones that don't leave. And so when the Buddha asked him, there in the Mrapple garden, to go again to that house, Mahākāśyapa said, with the quiet honesty of a man who knows his own limits, I cannot go. I am not able to engage in discourse with that man. He taught me something I did not expect to need to learn, and I am still holding it. There's something in that you might recognize. The lesson you didn't know you needed. The moment when what you thought was generosity turned out to have an edge of preference in it. We all have those, the kindness that was also, quietly, a way of organizing the world according to our own understanding of who deserves what. Mahākāśyapa's was unusually well-intentioned, and it still had the edge, most of ours do. That is not a failure, it is the beginning of seeing more clearly. Take a slow breath. In and out. Let that settle. Let the body go a little heavier. You do not need to solve anything tonight. You are already doing the only thing that is required, which is to rest here and let the story come to you. When you are ready, we will go on. The Buddha turned to Subti. Now Subti was known above all for his understanding of emptiness, nyat, the word that translates poorly and deserves a moment of care. Emptiness, in this tradition, does not mean nothing is there. It means that nothing is there in the fixed, solid, independent way we tend to feel it is. Things arise together, in relationship, and they do not carry a permanent essence locked inside them. A chair is not eternally a chair. It was once a tree, and before that a seed. And after the chair, it will be firewood, or splinters, or eventually soil. There is no moment when the chairness is absolutely real and separate from everything else. The teaching says, look closely enough, and you will find that characteristic in everything. And Subti, of all the disciples, was the one who had looked most closely. He understood this, or so it was understood. He went to Vimalakirti's house one morning to beg, as the disciples did, bowl in hand, door in sight. And Vimalakirti began to speak. He spoke about alms, about what it means to give food to a monk. He said, if you beg with true equality, then giving to you is like giving to all the Buddhas, past and present and to come. No discrimination. You are not a separate being receiving food. You are a point in a net. Feed you, feed the net. And then he went further. He said, if you abandon the view of emptiness and the view of non-emptiness alike, if you give up the teaching of no self and all the teachings about teachings, if you beg from a place that is not inside any view at all, not even the view that emptiness is true, because truth itself doesn't live in views, then the food you receive will be received rightly. And he kept going. The discourse, by the time it was done, had dismantled nearly every handhold Subti had thought he possessed. Each one of his understandings gently removed. Even the understanding of emptiness, which he thought was the roof, the final truth, Vimalakirti reached up and lifted away. You cannot cling even to the correct view. The correct view held tightly becomes another cage. Subti said afterward that he had wanted to set down his bowl and walk away, not from anger, from vertigo, because there was no stable floor left to stand on, and the strange thing was that Vimalakirti had done this not with cruelty but with perfect calm, as if dismantling every certainty was the kindest thing one person could do for another. He did not walk away. He stayed and listened. But the ground did not come back, and he was never quite sure, after that, which certainties were his to keep. And so to the Buddha's question he said, I cannot go. That man understands emptiness more thoroughly than I do. He would take everything I thought I knew, and I would have nothing left to offer. I am not the one. You may know what it is to have the floor lifted. Not always by a teacher, sometimes just by life, by the particular hour when something you'd built your thinking on simply isn't there anymore. A role ends, a certainty clears away, and you're standing in a space that doesn't quite have a name yet. Subti's vertigo was not a weakness. It was the beginning of something that doesn't have a name either. It's enough to have felt it. You don't have to have resolved it to rest. Let yourself go a little deeper now. Feel wherever the body meets the bed, and let that contact be enough. Just that much ground is all you need tonight. Take your time. The breath finds its own pace when you let it, and the Buddha turned, unhurried, to the next. Śāriputra was one of the great teachers. Where Śāriputra was praised for wisdom, Pra was praised for preaching, for the ability to set the Dharma into words in a way that opened things for people, that made difficult ideas land. He was good at this. He had spent years doing it. On the day he remembered, he had been teaching a group of young monks. He was doing what he did well, explaining, expounding, opening the texts for minds that were still new to them. He thought he was doing it well. He probably was. And then Vimalakirti appeared or was encountered and watched for a while and said something that Pra remembered exactly because it reached him in a place that praise usually doesn't. He said, before you teach someone, you need to know who they are. And you can only know who they are if you enter Samadhi first and look clearly. He said, if you put old, rotten food in a jeweled bowl, you have wasted the bowl. The food and the vessel have to match. He wasn't saying Pra's teaching was rotten food. He was saying something more careful than that. He was saying, the Dharma is the jeweled bowl, and the minds of the people listening are particular, and you cannot pour the same teaching into every mind and expect it to nourish everyone equally. To teach well, you have to meet the actual person in front of you. Read them. Know what they need. Enter the still place in yourself where their need becomes clear, and then, from that stillness, offer what matches. Teaching from habit is rotten food in a jeweled bowl. Teaching from performance is rotten food in a jeweled bowl. Teaching because you know how to teach, without first asking what this particular person today requires, that too is the same. The bowl is too beautiful to waste. Pra had been teaching from skill. That is not nothing. But Vimalakirti was suggesting that skill was only the beginning and that something prior to skill was where the real teaching lived. He said to the Buddha, I cannot go to that man's house. He would ask me to account for everything I said from habit rather than clarity, and I would have to sit there and count it. I am not ready for that conversation. This one, too, carries something ordinary. The difference between what we do from skill and what we do from attention. Sometimes they coincide, often they don't quite. The skilled action, the habitual kindness, the response we've learnt to give, it works. Often, and sometimes the person in front of us needed something slightly different. Something we might have seen if we had gone still for a moment first and looked. The jeweled bowl is available to all of us. The question is only what we pour into it. Rest with that gently. There is no action required tonight, just the noticing. That is already a kind of stillness. In, slowly, out, slowly, the room around you is quiet, and you are still here inside it, and that is enough. When you are ready, we continue. Mahākāśyapa had spent many years on something extraordinarily careful. He was the great analyst. Where others understood the teaching and moved on, He wanted to know the structure of it, how each doctrine fit with every other, what the exact relationship was between impermanence and no self, between suffering and desire, between arising and ceasing. He was the one you went to when you needed something explained precisely, when the teaching had edges and corners you couldn't quite see. He had a gift for this. He had built it patiently over many years of study and contemplation. And then he encountered Vimalakirti. He had been with a group of monks, and the subject was the classical teaching, impermanence, suffering, emptiness, no self, the four things the mind tends to cling to, the truth of how things actually are. He was explaining it carefully. He thought he was explaining it well. And Vimalakirti asked him gently, when you use your mind to preach about reality, about how things arise and cease, about what is permanent and what is not, do you notice that the mind you are using is itself impermanent, that the instrument of analysis is also part of what you're analyzing, that to think carefully about how reality works, you are using a reality-made tool, a discriminating, mortal, particular mind, one that slices the world into categories, because that is what minds do. And then he said, reality as such does not arise and does not cease. It does not have the quality of suffering or the quality of non-suffering. It does not divide into self and no self. All of those are descriptions from inside the activity of discrimination. They are maps, and the territory does not contain the map. If you want to point toward what is actually true, you cannot do it with the instrument that produces impermanence and permanence as categories. You have to point from somewhere prior to that. And what that pointing looks like is not another analysis. It looks like something else entirely. Mahākāśyapa listened to this. He was not a man who dismissed things quickly. He turned it over. He continued to turn it over. And the more he examined it, the more he found that Vimalakirti was right, and that the rightness was of a kind that his analysis could not quite get hold of, which was, he slowly understood exactly the point. He told the Buddha, I cannot have that conversation again so soon. Or perhaps ever. He is pointing at something my tools cannot reach. And I am not sure yet what to do with that. You may have experienced a version of this. The moment when the kind of thinking you are best at turns out not to be the kind of thinking the situation requires. When your particular way of being careful and precise meets something that is not helped by precision. When the careful, analytical part of the mind encounters something that can only be held in stillness. This is not a failure of the analysis. It is the beginning of a different kind of knowing. Mahākāśyapa was at that beginning, still turning the corner. We all turn it in our own time. Take a breath. Let the thinking slow down a little. You don't need to analyze the rest of this night. You can just receive it. The breath comes by itself. The weight of the body settles by itself. Let it. The Buddha turned to Aniruddha. Aniruddha was known for his divine eye, the ability to see what ordinary eyes cannot, across vast distances, through time, into the nature of things in their subtle forms. He had developed this over long years of practice, and it was real, and it was extraordinary, and he was, understandably, proud of it. Not boastfully, perhaps, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has cultivated something genuine. And Vimalakirti, in their encounter, let him describe it, let him speak about what the divine eye could perceive. And then, gently, the way a good teacher does, he placed a question against it. He said, the divine eye that you have developed, it sees things, it perceives them, And the one who sees is still a perceiver, still someone on one side of the act of seeing, still in the structure of subject and object, still inside a relationship to what is seen. The divine eye, magnificent as it is, still sees from somewhere, still looks. And a seeing that looks from somewhere carries, inside it, a subtle preference for what it is looking at. He was suggesting that even the most refined perception, if it remains a perception, even the most expanded sight, if it is still sight, has not yet reached what is actually prior to seeing and not seeing. And the way he said it meant that Aniruddha, sitting with his great gift, felt for a moment not enlarged by it, but slightly smaller, because the gift, for all its beauty, was still a thing the self had acquired. He went home, he thought about it for a long time. He is still, perhaps, thinking about it. And so he said to the Buddha, "Not me. I am not ready to match wits with him again." He dismantles very quietly and very completely, and I would rather sit here in the garden and let the morning settle. What we have cultivated is precious. The gifts developed over time, the capacities we have built, the ways of being in the world that were hard-won, they are not nothing. And sometimes a real teacher holds them gently in their hands and shows us the edge of them. Not to take them away, only to say, this is how far it goes, and here is what lies beyond it. The gift is not the destination. The gift is part of the path. That is enough for tonight. Rest here a moment. Breathe slowly. Notice the quiet. And the Buddha, still patient, turned to Upāli. Upāli was the keeper of the rules. This is not a small thing. In any tradition, in any human community, someone has to hold the agreements, the codes of conduct, the shared understandings about how to behave, what is allowed and what is not, how people repair what they have broken. Upāli had that role in the early Sangha. He had memorized the Vinaya, the entire body of monastic discipline, every rule and every case and every precedent. He was the one you went to when a monk had done something wrong and didn't know how to come back from it. And he had been counseling two monks who had done something they shouldn't have done, and who were, as people often are after those moments, in a state of considerable distress. Guilt can be a very heavy thing. It sits on the chest. It replays the moment of the mistake over and over, adding commentary each time, making the original act worse with every repetition. He had been trying to help. He had been going through the precepts with them, explaining what had been broken, what the path of repair looked like. This is what he knew how to do. He was doing it conscientiously. And Vimalakirti walked in and looked at the two monks and said, "Stop." He said to Upāli, "Do not heap more burden on these men by multiplying the analysis of their offence. An offence, in its true nature, is empty. It does not exist in the mind, it does not exist outside the mind, it does not exist between the two. The nature of the action is the same as the nature of all actions. It does not carry a permanent essence. When you go over and over a person's mistake with them, laying out the full anatomy of the error, you do not help them cleanse it. You give it more weight and more permanence than it actually has." He said, "The mind that made the error is the same mind that can release it. And it can only release it if it understands that the error is not a fixed thing, not a stain that has changed the essential nature of the one who made it. Look into the mind now. Is the fault there? Look carefully. Where is it?" The two monks listened. The guilt, for a moment, had something happen to it. Not that it vanished exactly, but the atmosphere around it changed. They could breathe. Upāli had stood there with all his rules and all his knowledge and watched Vimalakirti help those monks in a way that his rules alone could not. The rules were right, and they were not enough. He told the Buddha, "I am not able to go to that man's house and present myself as someone who understands discipline. He would ask me the nature of an offense, and I would have to say it is empty, and then he would ask me what I had been doing all these years with the Vinaya, and I would not know how to answer with the composure the question deserves. This is a tender one to rest in for a moment. We all carry guilt about something, some small thing or not so small. The mind goes back to it, it replays, it adds a little more weight each time. And what the sick householder in Vale said to those two monks, what he said gently, not to excuse them, not to erase the need for care, but to let the air back in, was this: look into the fault and find where it lives. Look carefully. The weight you are carrying is real, and it is also, at its center, empty. It does not define you. It is not the last word about who you are. The mind that made the mistake is the very same mind that can right now put the mistake down. Not permanently, perhaps these things come back, but even for a moment, just for this quiet moment, here in the dark, you can put it down. You don't have to carry it into sleep. Breathe slowly, in and out. The body knows how to rest. Let it remember. And when you are ready. Ruler was the son. This is perhaps the most quietly remarkable refusal in the whole long chapter, because Ruler was not only a disciple, he was the Buddha's own child. He had grown up in the shadow of the most luminous spiritual life the tradition remembers. He had entered the order. He had practiced with great seriousness. He was respected, looked up to, known for his adherence to all the forms, and in the encounter he remembered someone, a group of laymen, or perhaps a single young man thinking about the path, had asked him about renunciation, about what it meant to leave home, about the benefits of the going forth, of taking up the monastic life. It was a natural question to bring to Ruler, who was the son of the one who had most famously left everything. He had begun to answer. The benefits of leaving home, the freedom from household entanglement, the clarity that comes from simplicity. He was explaining these things in good faith, drawing on his own experience, and Vimalakirti interrupted him or entered the conversation and said, Don't tell them about the benefits of renunciation, not because renunciation is wrong, but because the way you are talking about it implies that the value lives in the act of leaving, that the gateway to understanding requires walking out the door of ordinary life. And these men, right here, these laymen standing in front of you, they are not going to walk out that door. They have families, businesses, children, commitments they cannot put down. And if you tell them that the benefit lives in leaving, you are telling them, indirectly, that the benefit is not for them. He said, Look at these men. Can they not raise the awakening mind? Can they not cultivate compassion, wisdom, clarity, the intention to practice for the benefit of all beings? Does any of that require a robe? That, he said, is the real going forth, not the geography, not the change of clothes. The going forth is the turning of the mind toward what is true and what is kind, and that turning can happen in a house, in a market, at a family dinner, in a bed at night. The layman in front of you could do it right now. That is what you should tell them. Ruler stood quietly with that. He had grown up understanding that his father had chosen to leave everything, and that this choice was the hinge on which everything else turned. And now a sick man in a house in Vale was saying, The hinge is not where you think it is. He said to the Buddha, I cannot go back and argue this with him. He is right, and I do not yet know what I would say. This is perhaps the heart of what the whole chapter is pointing toward, refusal by refusal. That the turning of the mind is not located in any particular life arrangement. That understanding does not require a specific address. That you, lying in your bed tonight, in the middle of your ordinary human life, with all its weight and its warmth and its difficulty, are not disqualified, were never disqualified. The sick man in veil understood this more clearly than the Buddha's own son, and it is offered to you here, quietly, in the dark, as a simple gift. Rest, take a slow breath. Feel the room around you. Feel whatever is holding you. You are right where you need to be, not somewhere else. Here, and the last one. Nanda was the one who had heard everything. That was his gift, and his role, and in some ways his whole identity within the early Sangha. He had been present for more teachings than anyone, had retained them all, had carried them in his memory with extraordinary fidelity. He was the living archive of what the Buddha had said. After the Buddha's death, it was Nanda who recited the teachings at the Great Council, beginning each one with the words, "Thus I have heard," so that the community could confirm what was genuine and preserve it. The entire body of what was passed down depends, in part, on Nanda's memory. This is no small thing. And his encounter with Vimalakirti was not a philosophical argument. It was quieter than that. He had been going out to beg milk for the Buddha, who was reportedly unwell, a small practical errand. He had his bowl, he had his intention, he was on his way. And Vimalakirti appeared and said, "Stop. Don't say that aloud. Don't let outsiders hear you say that the Tathagata is ill and needs milk. The Tathagata's body is adamantine. It is beyond the ordinary nature of physical bodies, beyond sickness and health, in the way you and I might understand sickness and health. If you go through the city saying the Buddha is ill and you are fetching medicine for him, people who do not know the teaching will draw the wrong conclusions. They will think the one who is said to have understood the nature of suffering is, after all, subject to it in the same way any body is. This will cause confusion. This will harm the teaching. It was said with care, not as an accusation. Nanda had not been wrong to want to help. The impulse was right. The errand was kind. But the framing of it, even the framing of a kind errand, done in love, has consequences in the world, and Vimalakirti, who moved through the world with extraordinary attention to consequence, had seen it. Nanda stood there, holding his empty bowl, and thought about it. He thought about the relationship between intention and framing, between what we mean and what is heard, between the pure act and the ripple the pure act sends through the world. He said to the Buddha, "I am not able to go to that man's house and hold my own in conversation. Even the simplest errand, he showed me, has more in it than I had seen. I am not the one." And so the Buddha had been through all 10 of them, the wisest, the most powerful, the most disciplined, the most analytical, the most perceptive, the most devoted to the rules, the son, and the one who had heard the most. Each one asked, each one remembering, each one, with honesty and a little sheepishness, saying, "Please, not me, I am not ready for that room." The chapter turns like this, refusal by refusal, and it is so human that it is almost funny, and it is almost funny in a way that is also very moving. Because these are not cowards. These are the greatest practitioners the tradition had produced. And they are all, in their own ways, still learning, still encountering something that reaches them where they live, still finding the edges of what they understood. And the thing that reached each of them, the thing that none of them could quite face again, was a man who lived in the world fully, with no distance between himself and the ordinary mess of human life, and who understood something they didn't. Something about the nature of discrimination, or guilt, or tools, or what it means to see, or where wisdom actually lives when you aren't looking for it in special circumstances. And he was sick in a bed. And he had gotten sick on purpose. And the illness was the world's illness, and the room was full of teaching, and nobody wanted to go. Almost nobody. The Buddha paused. He had been through 10 of them. 10 conversations, each beginning with the same gentle request. Would you go to Vale? Would you look in on this man? Would you inquire after his health? And each one answered with the same honest reluctance, the same memory surfacing like something from the bottom of a still pond, bringing with it a residue of astonishment that had never quite settled. He did not press them. That is worth noticing. He simply heard each one and moved on. There is something very quiet in that. A teacher who knows when a refusal is not a failure. And now there were others to ask. The straw moves here from the great disciples, the śrāvakas, those who had travelled with the Buddha, who had heard the teaching from the source, and turns toward the bodhisattvas. These are figures of a different order. Where the disciples had devoted themselves to their own liberation, to understanding this path all the way to its end, the bodhisattvas had taken a vow of an almost impossible breadth, to remain, to stay close to the world, to work toward the awakening of all beings rather than only their own. If anyone should be able to walk through a sick man's door and hold their ground in difficult conversation, it would be one of these. The Buddha turned to Maitreya. Take a slow breath here. There is no rush. Maitreya is a figure the tradition holds in particular tenderness. He is the bodhisattva who is said to be the next Buddha, the one waiting in a heaven called Tuita, ready to descend to this world in some vast future age to continue the work of teaching. His name comes from the word for loving kindness. He is, in a sense, the embodiment of what is still to come, the warm promise of a future that has not arrived yet but is held in readiness, the way a letter sits sealed and waiting. The Buddha asked him, "Will you go to Vale?" And Maitreya remembered. He had once been in the presence of the god Indra, the great lord of the Devas, the ruler of a celestial realm, and a crowd of divine beings had gathered, and they were asking him about his prediction. About the fact that it had been foretold that in a future life, in some age to come, Maitreya would attain complete and perfect awakening and become the next Buddha of this world. The Devas were celebrating this. They were delighted. They were, in their way, congratulating him. And Vimalakirti walked in. He looked at the whole scene, the congratulations, the celebration of the prediction, the forward-looking joy, and he asked a question, a gentle question, the kind that turns the room over slowly, like a smooth stone. He asked, what, exactly, is it that will awaken? What is the Maitreya who will become Buddha? Is there a fixed, persisting self that moves through time and one day arrives at Buddhahood? If awakening is the seeing through of the illusion of a solid, permanent self, then what is it that gets predicted? Who will be there to receive the announcement? The question did not dismiss Maitreya. It did not say the prediction was wrong. It asked him to look more carefully at the structure of what receiving a prediction even means, whether the concept requires exactly the kind of thing that deep understanding dissolves. Maitreya sat with that. The Devas sat with it too, probably in silence, which is the only dignified response to a question that good. And so now, standing near the Mrapple garden, remembering, Maitreya said to the Buddha, I am not able to go to that man and hold my own in discussion. He sees something I am still turning over. Please, not me. Rest here for a moment. Notice the weight of the night around you, the softness of where you are lying. You do not need to hold any of this in your memory. It will do its work without your effort. The Buddha turned next to the bodhisattva, sometimes called prabhya, a name that carries the sense of glorious arrangement, of a splendor that is ordered and wide. He is described sometimes as one whose form shines, whose presence has a quality of light, a radiant figure. He too remembered. He had been walking through the streets of Vale one morning. This is how the Sutra tells it. And Vimalakirti saw him and asked where he was going. He said he was going to take his morning exercise, to walk, to move through the world and let the body stretch and breathe and meet the morning in the ordinary way that bodies want to do. And Vimalakirti smiled and said, "The body is impermanent. To exercise it for its own sake, as though it were a permanent possession, is to tend something that will not last in the way you are tending it. But, and here is where it turns, what would it mean to truly exercise? What would it look like to walk in a way that carries the whole of what you know? To be in the body, in the morning, in the street, without the illusion of ownership, without the small, persistent claim that this body is mine and I am improving it. It was not a dismissal of walking. It was a question about how to walk, what it means to be present in a body while understanding the nature of that body, how to do ordinary things without ordinary forgetfulness. Prabhya had been thinking about it ever since. He told the Buddha, "I am not able to go. That man will ask me something I do not yet have an answer to. Please." And the Buddha moved on. Next was the bodhisattva called Jagatdhara, a name that means something like upholder of the world, the one who supports what holds everything together, a figure of quiet strength. He was the one whose story is perhaps the strangest and in its own way the most quietly funny of the bodhisattvas' encounters. He had been sitting in his own dwelling, still absorbed in practice, when he heard a sound at the door. He looked up, and there were 12,000 goddesses standing outside. 12,000, each one luminous and beautiful, and offering themselves as attendants. They had come, they said, to serve him. Now, the one who had sent them was Missa. Missa is the figure in the Buddhist cosmos who is the closest thing the tradition has to a tempter, not evil in the Western theological sense, not the adversary of all good, but something subtler. Missa is the force that pulls toward attachment, toward distraction, toward the entanglement in things that seem desirable and therefore keep the mind from seeing clearly. Missa tests. Missa offers things, and what Missa offers is usually beautiful. These 12,000 goddesses were beautiful. They were offered as a gift, as a kind of tribute to this great bodhisattva, and Jagatdhara, who was devoted to practice, who was genuinely good, did not know what to do. He could not, in good conscience, take them. But he also did not want to send 12,000 luminous beings out into the night, with nowhere to go. He was still turning it over when Vimalakirti arrived, or perhaps he was already there. The Sutra moves fluidly between such things. Vimalakirti looked at the 12,000 goddesses, he looked at the bodhisattva's uncertainty, and he immediately saw what Jagatdhara had not yet seen, that the one who had sent them was not a generous donor. It was Missa. The whole display was a disguise. Indra, the lord of the Devas, had been impersonated. These 12,000 divine attendants were an offering built from attachment. Their beauty was the point. Their beauty was the test. Vimalakirti said to the goddesses, "I will take them." He accepted what had been sent on Jagatdhara's behalf, and then he gave them something. He gave them the teaching. He spoke to them, those 12,000 luminous beings who had been sent as a temptation, and he taught them, gently, fully, until their understanding deepened, until they had received something worth far more than the service they had been asked to render. He turned the trap into a teaching. He took what had been sent as a distraction and made it into a door. And then he sent them back to Missa, no longer as a temptation, but as a transmission. The Sutra does not record what Missa made of this. Perhaps that silence is also a kind of answer. Jagadhara said to the Buddha, "I cannot go." He saw through something I missed entirely. He saw Missa where I only saw beauty. I am not ready for that room. Let that land. The breath is slow, and the night is quiet. You are not required to understand anything right now. Just let the story move through you, like water finding its level. The last of the bodhisattvas to offer his memory was the one the Sutra calls Sudatta, sometimes translated as excellent virtue or good giving. He was a young man from a wealthy family in Vale, and he had once organized a great almsgiving, a feast of generosity. For 7 days he had set out offerings, food, robes, medicines, all manner of things the body needs, and the people had come. And it had been a beautiful thing, a generous and heartfelt thing, the kind of thing that takes months to organize, and that you remember for years afterward, because it brought so much goodness into one place. Vimalakirti had come to the feast. He had looked at all of it, the tables, the offerings, the crowds, the quiet satisfaction of doing something kind on a large scale, and he had said, with gentleness, with no diminishment of what was there, "This is a fine almsgiving. But there is a gift greater than this. There is the gift of Dharma. The gift of Dharma is not food, it is not cloth, it is not medicine, though all of those things matter, and they matter deeply. The gift of Dharma is the offering of understanding, the offering that allows a person to see the nature of suffering and begin, slowly, to find a way through it. The material gifts sustain the body for a time. The gift of understanding can change the entire orientation of a life. One of these, Vimalakirti said, is greater. Not because the body's needs don't count, they do, they always do, but because the deepest poverty is not the absence of food, it is the absence of clarity. It is not knowing why you are suffering, or what the suffering is made of, or whether there is a way through. Sudatta remembered standing there, surrounded by all his careful preparations, and feeling not ashamed but deepened, not criticized but expanded, as though he had thought he was carrying a great gift, and then discovered there was a larger one he hadn't known existed. He said to the Buddha, "I cannot go to that man's house. He would show me something I am still not sure how to hold." Not yet. And the room was quiet. 10 great disciples, 4 great bodhisattvas, 14 of the most revered, most practiced, most trusted figures the tradition had to offer. All of them honest, all of them remembering, all of them, in the end, saying, "Not me." The Buddha looked at one more. "Take a breath. Let the body settle a little more. You are already doing this. You are already here." The one he looked at was Mañjuśrī. Mañjuśrī is the bodhisattva of wisdom. If you have ever seen a painting or a statue of him, you may remember he is depicted holding a sword in one hand and a book in the other. The sword cuts through confusion. The book holds understanding. He is the one who sees clearly, whose weapon is insight, whose whole nature is the quality of a mind that has learned to look directly at things without flinching and without distortion. If any being in the assembly was equipped to walk through a sick man's door and meet whatever was waiting there, it was this one. The Buddha asked him, "Will you go?" And Mañjuśrī did not refuse. He paused. He said something that is worth hearing slowly, because it has a particular quality of honesty in it. He said, Vimalakirti is difficult to match in discussion. He is profound. He is deep in the understanding of what things are. He speaks with an ease that comes from having passed through something, and what he says lands with a precision that is hard to prepare for. I will go. But this will not be easy. That acknowledgement, I will go, but it will not be easy, is not weakness. It is something closer to courage, dressed in accurate language. It does not pretend. It does not announce itself grandly. It says, I see what I am walking into, and I am walking in anyway. And the moment he agreed, something happened in the garden. The whole crowd that had been listening, thousands of bodhisattvas, hundreds of disciples, all the gathered beings who had been watching this exchange refusal by refusal, the entire crowd rose and said, We are going too. Not to help, not to intervene, to watch, to be present for whatever was about to happen between these two, Mañjuśrī, the wisdom bodhisattva, and Vimalakirti, the sick householder, because anyone paying attention had understood by now that when those two were in the same room, something rare happened, something worth witnessing, something that might not come again in quite this form. The Sutra says they followed major to veil, bodhisattvas and disciples and laypeople and devas and asuras and all manner of beings, a vast, almost inconceivable crowd, walking behind a single figure who had agreed to visit one sick man in a room. And in veil, Vimalakirti knew they were coming. He had known, of course, in the way that the Sutra's Vimalakirti always knows. He had been lying on his couch in his illness, and now he used his ability, which the text calls inconceivable, to empty his room. Not just tidy it, empty it. Every piece of furniture, every servant, every object. He removed everything from that room until there was nothing in it but himself, on a single couch, in a bare space. The room that had been full of life, the home of a wealthy householder, with all the texture and accumulation that implies, was now simply a room, a couch, a man. And he waited. There is something in that image that is worth resting in. A man who owns things, who has things, who lives in the world with all the attendant fullness of a householder's life, and who can, when the moment asks for it, let all of it go, pull it away from the room, stand or lie in an emptiness without grasping. The room emptied is not an abandonment of the life. It is a demonstration that the life does not cling, that Vimalakirti has things and uses things and moves through a world full of things, and none of it has hold of him. The room was ready. Mañjuśrī arrived first and came to the door. The crowd pressed in behind him, and what Mañjuśrī saw, stepping into that bare room, was Vimalakirti lying on his couch, smiling. They greeted each other. And then, because neither of them were capable of an ordinary conversation, they immediately began. They spoke about the nature of illness, about what it means that Vimalakirti has manifested this sickness deliberately, out of compassion. Because the world is sick, and so he is sick alongside it. They spoke about emptiness, about the body, about what it means to be well, and what it means to be unwell, when you understand those terms as fully as these two do. But the great crowd had arrived behind Mañjuśrī. Thousands, tens of thousands of beings, pressing through the door of a house in veil, wanting to be in this room for this conversation. And Śāriputra, who had been there for all of it, who had heard his own refusal accepted and yet come along to witness, looked at the room and felt a familiar kind of concern. The practical kind. The kind that lives in anyone who has ever tried to fit too many people into too small a space. He thought, where will everyone sit? It is such a human thought. The greatest wisdom debate in the history of the tradition is about to take place, and someone is wondering about seating. It is not a silly thought. It comes from good intentions. It comes from wanting things to go well, from caring about the beings who have arrived, from a practical attention to whether people have a place to be. There is nothing wrong with it. But it is, in this context, also a very small thought. And Vimalakirti knew what Śāriputra was thinking. He asked him directly, "Have you come here for the Dharma, Śāriputra? Or have you come for a seat?" Śāriputra said, "I came for the Dharma." "Good," Vimalakirti said. "Then the one who seeks Dharma does not seek a seat. The one who seeks understanding has already found the ground that does not require furniture. But, and this is where the miracle comes in, because the Shra is generous and Vimalakirti is not unkind, he does not simply leave everyone standing. He has something else in mind. There is, in the vast reach of the cosmos, as the Mañjuśrī map it, a Buddha land. A world purified and illuminated by the presence of a fully awakened being, whose presiding Buddha is called Merudvaja. The name means something like Sumeru, Lamp King, Sumeru being the great mountain at the center of the cosmos in the Indian cosmological imagination, and the name combining that mountain with the image of a torch or beacon. A mountain of light, a lamp at the center of everything. In the Buddha land of Merudvaja, there are thrones made for the bodhisattvas of that realm. Each one is a lion throne, the lion being the traditional symbol of a teacher whose presence commands attention the way a lion commands a landscape, not through threat, but through an unmistakable quality of being. And each throne is 84,000 yojanas tall. A yohana is a unit of distance from ancient India, roughly the distance a yoke of oxen can pull a cart in a day, perhaps 7 or 8 miles, or more depending on the calculation. It doesn't matter precisely. What matters is 84,000 of them. These thrones are not small. They are not the kind of thing you move across a room and slide under a table. They are the size of mountains. They are the size of countries. They are objects so large that the concept of fitting them anywhere is, on its face, completely absurd. Vimalakirti requested 32,000 of them. He asked Mañjuśrī to convey a request to the Buddha Merudvaja, "Please send 32,000 of your lion thrones to this house in Vaiśālī, so that the bodhisattvas and senior figures of the great crowd who have come to visit may have a place to sit." And Merudvaja agreed. He sent the thrones. What happened next is one of the things the Shra calls asintya vimokkha. Asintya means inconceivable, literally beyond what the thinking mind can frame. Vimokkha means liberation, freedom, release, inconceivable liberation. The liberation that cannot be grasped by the ordinary structures of thought because it operates in a register where those structures do not apply. 32,000 thrones, each 84,000 yojanas tall, arrived in the room. The room did not grow. The thrones did not shrink. The city of Vaiśālī did not expand to accommodate them. The street outside Vimalakirti's house remained the street outside Vimalakirti's house. And yet every throne was there, fully present, the bodhisattvas and great beings taking their places on them, seated as they would have been seated in the vast realm of Merudvaja, and the room held all of it, and the room was still just a room in a city on the bank of a river in the land of the Likavis. How does this work? The Shra does not explain it mechanically. It presents it as a demonstration, an instance of what becomes possible when you have seen through the assumption that space is a fixed container with a fixed capacity. In the ordinary framework, the one most of us use most of the time, the one where things have sizes and rooms have walls, and a large thing cannot fit in a small space. The thrones could not be there, the math doesn't work, the picture doesn't make sense, but the ordinary framework is built on a kind of taking for granted, on the assumption that our perceptions of size and space and containment are final, that the walls of the room are the walls of possibility. Asintya vimokkha is not a magic trick, it is a consequence. It is what follows from a particular kind of freedom, freedom from the compulsive solidity of ordinary perception, from the grip of fixed frameworks, from the belief that what appears to be bounded is permanently and essentially bounded. Vimalakirti lives in that freedom. It is part of what the text is showing, not as a spectacular power to be envied or imitated, but as an illustration. This is what the understanding he carries looks like from the outside. This is the room that holds what a room cannot hold. The bodhisattvas were seated. The great beings were present. The room was full, in whatever sense full means here, which is a different sense than usual, and Śāriputra, who had asked where everyone would sit, was sitting. There is a gentleness in that too. His concern was met. His practical attention was honoured, not scorned. Everyone found a place. The question of seating was resolved. It was just resolved in a way that Śāriputra had not imagined when he asked it, because the resolution came from a place he could not yet reach with his ordinary thinking. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice what has softened. Notice the quiet in the room where you are, the small, reliable weight of your body finding its own rest. You do not need to understand the inconceivable to lie here in it. You are already inside a mystery you did not build and do not maintain. Your heart is beating right now without your instruction. Your lungs are moving. The darkness is here. All of this is already true. When you are ready, we will continue together. The room in Vale was full. Mañjuśrī was seated. Vimalakirti was on his couch. And the conversation that had been building across the whole of the Mrapal garden, through 14 refusals, through the long walk to the city, was finally in the room where it needed to be. There is something worth saying about what Śāriputra's worry and its resolution tells us. Not as a lesson to apply or a principle to memorize, just as something to feel on the edge of sleep. All of us have at some point stood in a room or in a life and looked at what needed to happen and thought, I don't see how. I don't see where there is space. The situation seems too tight. The thing that needs to fit doesn't fit. The people, the needs, the circumstances, the emotional weight of what you are carrying, none of it seems to have anywhere to go that makes sense. The walls are where they are. The math is what it is. And sometimes, not always, not on command, not through effort, something opens. Not the walls, not the math. Something in the seeing of it. Some assumption releases, quietly, like a hand that has been held in a fist for so long that when it opens you are almost surprised to find fingers. And what could not be held is held. The Sutra calls that inconceivable liberation, not because it is impossible, but because it is beyond what the thinking mind, the ordinary, boundary-assuming, measuring mind, can conceive in advance. It happens after the conceiving stops. It happens in the stillness, the way the solution to a problem you've been pressing against all day sometimes arrives the moment you stop pressing and lie down. 32,000 thrones, a room that held them. A man on a couch who had gotten sick on purpose, who had emptied his house of everything except himself, who was waiting to speak with the only one who had agreed to come. That man had a wife. He had a family. He had servants, though he had sent them away for now. He had a house in a real city. He moved through taverns and gambling halls and all the ordinary troubled places where ordinary troubled people live. He was not behind a monastery wall. He was not in a forest. He was not defined by what he had renounced, and the greatest wisdom bodhisattva in the cosmos had just walked through his door. The crowd was seated on impossible thrones, and the room held all of them, and the city was still the city, and the river was still the river, and the evening was still the evening. And it was just beginning. There was a goddess living in his house. Not a metaphor, not a symbol the scholars decided to unpack centuries later. The text says it plainly. A goddess had taken up residence in Vimalakirti's home, and she had been there long enough to have heard every teaching that had ever been given inside those walls. She had listened to all of it. She had absorbed all of it. And when the crowd arrived, the vast crowd that had followed Mañjuśrī through the door, settled now on their impossible thrones, filling a room that had no business holding them, she scattered flowers. She scattered heavenly flowers over the bodhisattvas and the disciples alike. This is where the Sutra does something so quiet and so precise that you might miss it if the narration moves too fast. So let us slow down here. Let us stay in this room for a moment. The flowers fell on everyone, on Mañjuśrī, on the great bodhisattvas, on the 10 disciples who had finally, reluctantly, made their way through the door after declining for so long. The flowers fell on all of them equally, because a goddess scattering flowers does not discriminate. She offered the same gift to everyone in the room. And on the bodhisattvas, the flowers did not stay. They slid off. Effortlessly, the way water slides off a stone that has been smoothed by a long time in a river. The flowers touched them and fell away, and that was that. But on the disciples, on Śāriputra and the others, the 10 great monks who had each in their own way been bested by this layman before they ever agreed to walk through his door, on them the flowers stuck. They clung. Śāriputra looked at himself, a flower, a heavenly flower, resting on his robe, and it would not fall. He brushed at it, the gesture you make when something has landed on you that you want gone. A light, automatic, slightly embarrassed brush of the hand, and the flower did not move. He tried again. It stayed. He tried again. It stayed. The goddess was watching. She said, gently, that the flowers were not the problem. The flowers were not clinging. Something in him was clinging, and the flower had simply found it. The bodhisattvas carried no discrimination, no invisible interior line between what belongs and what does not, what is pure and what is impure, what is high and what is low. And so nothing clung to them, because there was nothing to catch on. The disciples still carried such lines, quietly, underneath everything they knew and taught and practiced, not as a failure, just as a kind of residue. The residue of the distinction-making mind, which is also, the goddess said, the mind that learns, that studies, that progresses, that climbs. It is a good mind. It has brought you a long way. But it leaves a certain texture behind. And heavenly flowers, it turns out, are very sensitive to texture. Take a slow breath here if you like. Notice where your body rests against whatever is beneath you. The weight of it. The warmth of it. When Śāriputra had stopped trying to brush the flower away, because the flower was not going anywhere, and he was beginning to understand why, he asked the goddess a question. It is the kind of question that sounds polite, but carries an edge of something else underneath. He asked her why she didn't change, why she remained in this form, a female form. There is a subtext in the question that the centuries have not softened much. You have clearly some understanding. Don't you want to become something higher?" The goddess paused, and then she did something remarkable. She swapped bodies with him. One moment she stood before him in her form, and he stood before her in his, and then the reverse was true. He was standing in her body, and she was standing in his, with all the ease of someone setting down one book and picking up another. The crowd in the room, seated on their thrones that should not have fit, but did, watched this with the steady attention of people who had already, this evening, revised their sense of what a room can contain. Śāriputra stood in a woman's body and looked at himself, at his own body, now inhabited by the goddess, and he could not find the difference. Not in the way that mattered. He felt the same awareness, the same capacity, the same whatever it is that had been sitting in Dina under trees for years, that had been present for all those teachings, that had worried about where everyone was going to sit when the thrones appeared. That same something was here, now, regardless of the form it was currently wearing. The goddess said, with the mildest possible directness, "In all phenomena there is neither male nor female. Form is what it is, and then it changes, and what you take to be yourself is neither of those forms, and never was." The question of why she didn't change out of her female body assumed that her female body was a kind of obstacle, something between her and something better. And she was pointing at the fact that this assumption was the very thing the flowers had found and stuck to. She changed them back, just as easily. And Śāriputra stood again in his own body, and the goddess stood in hers, and the flower was still there on his robe, and the evening was still holding the room in its quiet. There is something in that exchange, if you let it sit with you in the dark. The idea that the form you happen to occupy, the age you are, the health or illness of the body you are in, the shape of the life you have built around yourself, none of it is the obstacle. The thing that clings is not the form. It is the assumption about the form. The story about what the form means, about what is possible for you. The invisible ranking that says, this kind of life gets this kind of access, and that kind of life gets less. That kind of ranking is what clings, and it clings not because it is evil, but because it is so well practiced that you have stopped noticing you are doing it. The goddess and Śāriputra stood in each other's forms for a moment, and neither found a boundary there that the other did not have. That is not nothing. That is in fact quite a lot. Rest now, if you like. You do not need to hold this thought. You do not need to take notes. If anything in this room has gently touched something in you, it will stay on its own, the way things do when you stop trying to make them stay. Take a slow breath. Notice whatever is quiet in you right now. Even a small quiet, even a corner of quiet in an otherwise busy evening. That is enough. When you are ready, we will continue. The teaching was still going. The room was still holding everyone. And there was food to consider. At some point in the gathering, the question of how to feed an assembly this size, this vast, this improbable, arrived the way practical questions always arrive, just when the philosophical ones are going so well. Where does one get food for a crowd like this? And Vimalakīrti, who had already borrowed 32,000 thrones from a Buddha land and arranged them in a room without enlarging it, was not without ideas. He sent a bodhisattva, an emanation, a kind of projected form, a figure that was in some sense an extension of himself, the way a dream figure is an extension of the dreamer, to a place the Sutra calls the land of many fragrances. Its Buddha is named Sugandhaka, which you can translate as accumulated fragrance or sometimes heap of fragrance. The name tells you something about the place. In that land, the Sutra says, beings are not taught by words. There are no discourses, no debates, no skilled and unskilled questions, no flowers sticking to some robes and not others. The teaching in that land is carried entirely by scent. The inhabitants breathe in a fragrance, and, in the breathing, something is understood that could not have been conveyed by any sentence ever formed. It is hard to imagine, or rather, it is easy to almost imagine. The way you can almost remember a dream, you know the shape of it, without being able to quite see it. A whole culture of understanding that passes not through argument or even story, but through what drifts on the air. Through the smell of rain before it arrives, through the particular scent of a house you grew up in that carries, in a single breath, more information than pages of description could. That, the emanated bodhisattva went there and came back with a bowl of food. One bowl. The assembly looked at the bowl. The assembly was very large. The math was not promising. But the bowl did not empty. However much was taken from it, however many people were served, the bowl stayed full. The food it carried had come from a land where everything works by a different logic than the one you use to plan a dinner party, and so the ordinary accounting did not apply. There was enough. There was always enough. And the food itself carried something of the fragrance it had come from. A quality that could not be fully named, only noticed. There is something restful in that image, if you let yourself stay with it, not the miracle of the inexhaustible bowl exactly, though that is what the story says. Something subtler. The idea that what is needed is not in short supply. That the resources for the understanding you are looking for are not being rationed, parcelled out only to those who have achieved a certain standing or completed a certain number of things. That somewhere there is enough. That it comes to the gathering rather than making the gathering earn it. You may not believe this. You do not need to believe it tonight. It is enough to hear the story. The food was passed around. The room held everyone. The evening had been going for a long time already, and the people in that room had heard and said and witnessed things that a person might ordinarily expect to last a lifetime. But there was one more thing. There was one more question. Vimalakirti asked it himself. He turned to the bodhisattvas assembled in that improbable room, on those thrones that should not have fit but did, and he asked, how does a bodhisattva enter the Dharma gate of non-duality? Non-duality, Advaya in Sanskrit, not two. The state or understanding or way of being in which the ordinary divisions that structure experience, this side and that side, self and other, pure and impure, coming and going, have been seen through in some fundamental way, not collapsed into one muddy, undifferentiated thing, not argued away, but seen through, the way you see through a window. The glass is still there, but it is no longer what you see. This is the question that had been circling the whole evening. In a way, it had been circling the whole Sutra, through all the refusals, through the impossible room, through the flowers that stuck and the body swap and the inexhaustible bowl. What does it mean to be someone who has really, genuinely understood this? Not as a concept, not as an answer you can give correctly on a test, but as something lived, something inhabited. And so the bodhisattvas took turns. There were, by some counts in the text, 31 of them who spoke, and each one named a pair. A duality. Two things that seem opposed, and the transcendence of that opposition, what you arrive at when you stop taking the opposition as final. One by one, like people going around a table, each one offered their answer. Arising and ceasing, said one. When you no longer see arising as different from ceasing, when you see that what arises has always been in its nature already the ceasing of something else, and the ceasing is already the ground of what arises, in that seeing there is no gap between them. That gap closing is the entrance. Self and other, said another. When the boundary between what you call yourself and what you call not yourself becomes something you hold lightly rather than something you defend without knowing you are defending it. Purity and defilement. Coming and going. Time and timelessness. Sasra and nirva. The world of ordinary suffering and turning, and the peace beyond it. One after another, each pair was named, and each name was an offering, a pointing, a small quiet arrow aimed at something just beyond where arrows can reach. They were beautiful answers. They were true answers as far as they went. They each opened something, and they each remained, inescapably, answers made of words, shaped by the discriminating mind that had understood something about the transcendence of discrimination and was using discrimination to describe it, because that is all words can do. The last of the bodhisattvas to speak, before the question came to Mañjuśrī, was whoever happened to be seated just before him. And then it was Mañjuśrī's turn. Mañjuśrī, the bodhisattva of wisdom, the one who had agreed to come when everyone else declined, the one who had said, before stepping through the door, that Vimalakīrti was someone formidable, that the exchange would be hard to match. He had not been wrong about that. He had watched everything that happened in this room tonight, and he had understood all of it. And now the question was his. He said in all things no words, no speech, no showing and no knowing. Beyond all question and answer, that is entering non-duality. Then he turned to Vimalakirti, and he asked him. We have each spoken, said Mañjuśrī. Each of us has offered what we understand. Now you tell us, what is a bodhisattva's entrance into the gate of non-duality? The room was full. The thrones were all occupied. The bowl had been passed around. The flowers had been scattered and had stayed where they stayed. The goddess had swapped bodies with a disciple and swapped back. The conversation had been going for hours. Every person in that room was someone of enormous learning, someone who had sat with these questions for years or lifetimes, someone who had come specifically to hear what would be said. Everyone was listening. Vimalakīrti said nothing. He did not gesture. He did not smile knowingly. He did not pause and then speak. He simply did not speak. He was there, on the couch, present and awake and fully attending, and no sound came. And Mañjuśrī, who had just said that the entrance into non-duality was beyond words, looked at the silence and said, "Excellent. Not even words or letters. This is truly entering the gate of non-duality." The tradition later called it Vimalakirti's thunderous silence, which is itself a beautiful contradiction, a silence that is thunder, an absence that is a teaching. The loudest answer ever given was the one that used no sounds at all. There is a pause here in the straw, and perhaps there should be a pause here too. You do not need to understand this. You do not need to arrive at a conclusion about silence and non-duality tonight, in this bed, in this half-dreaming state. The understanding that arrives through the thinking mind is not what the straw is pointing at. The straw knows this better than most texts, because the straw just demonstrated it. Mañjuśrī's answer was true, and it was not enough. 31 bodhisattvas' answers were each in their own way true, and they were not enough. Not because the answers were wrong, but because the question lives somewhere that answers cannot quite reach. What can reach it, perhaps, is something more like what you are doing right now. Lying still, not pressing, not pushing toward anything, letting the evening settle around you the way the silence settled around that room in Vale. Silence is not empty. This is what the room knew in that moment after Vimalakirti did not speak. Silence is not the absence of something, it is its own presence. It has texture and weight and the particular quality of being after something and before something, of holding both of those without collapsing into either. You know this, you have felt it, in smaller ways, in ordinary moments, the silence of a house after everyone else has gone to sleep. The silence of a walk on a morning with no wind. The silence between one thing and the next when you are not yet reaching for the next thing. Those silences have something in them. They do not feel like nothing. They feel, if anything, like more than the sounds that surround them. The Sutra says, Vimalakirti was silent, and it was thunder. That is not a logical statement. But it is not false. Let yourself be quiet now, if you can. Let whatever has been moving in you tonight slow a little. You do not need to solve anything. You do not need to cross-reference this with other things you know. You can simply be in the room with the silence, the way the crowd was at the end of the argument that ended by stopping. Take a long, slow breath. Let it out slowly. Notice the weight of your body, the places where you are held. When you are ready, we will come to the last few things. There is one more thing the Sutra shows us before it ends. One more gift in the room. At some point, Vimalakirti revealed something about himself, who he was underneath everything, where he had come from. He had come from Abhirati, the Pure Land. It means something like profound joy, or sometimes the joyful land of the Buddha Akobhya, whose name means the immovable. Not a place you can find on any map of the world as ordinary sight perceives it. A realm of the kind the Mahāyāna tradition populates its cosmos with, other Buddha lands, other modes of existence, other expressions of what this universe might contain, if you stop assuming the version visible to ordinary eyes is the whole of it. And to make this real, to make it something the room could actually witness rather than simply hear claimed, he lifted it. He took the entire Buddha land of Akobhya, the whole of that realm, with all its beings and its mountains and its rivers and whatever constitutes the sky there, and he held it up. The way you hold a mango in your hand. That is the image the Sutra uses. The way you might lift a piece of fruit to the light to see it better. Vimalakirti, lying on his couch in a small room in Vale, held a universe in his palm and showed it to the people seated on their impossible thrones. This, the Sutra is saying, is the scale at which Vimalakirti operates. He did not come from the ordinary world into the understanding. He came from something like the understanding into the ordinary world, took on the form of a householder, acquired an illness, walked into gambling houses and taverns and brothels to be present where presence was needed, out-argued every wise person who came near him, manifested an inconceivable room, received the bodhisattva of wisdom, sat with a goddess who scattered flowers and swapped bodies to make a point, served food from a land of fragrance, and then, at the end of it all, answered the highest question with nothing. And this is Vimalakirti, the man with the wife and the house and the family and the servants he had sent away for the day. The text is not asking you to believe that a literal householder from a literal city once literally held a universe in his hand. The text is pointing at something about what an ordinary life contains when it is fully inhabited, when nothing in it is used as an excuse to close off, when the tavern and the gambling house and the sickbed are all, in their own way, places where you can be present without flinching. Rest here for a moment. That is the end of the stra's own story. But the story of what happened to the stra, where it went, how it travelled, who it reached, is worth lingering with, because it is part of what it means that you are hearing it tonight. The text was composed in India around the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, and it was written first in Sanskrit. Then it moved, the way important things move, across borders and into other languages and other minds. A monk named Ji Qian made an early Chinese translation in the 3rd century. And then, in the year 406 of the Common Era, a scholar-translator named Kumārajīva made the version that would become the one people actually loved. Kumārajīva's life was, in its own way, a story about what does not disqualify you. He was born in Central Asia, studied throughout the Buddhist world, and spent years as a captive before being brought to the Chinese capital to do the translation work that made him famous. His circumstances were not ideal. They were, in many ways, the opposite of ideal. And the translation he produced of the Vimalakīrti Nirdeśa Sūtra was so alive, so literary, so close to what you might call the spirit of the original, that it became the version people read for over 1,000 years. His Kumārajīva version of 406 was the foundation for everything that followed in East Asia. It was Kumārajīva's Vimalakirti who walked into the gambling houses. Kumārajīva's Vimalakirti, who stayed silent at the end. The Tang dynasty poet Wang Wei loved the text so much that he named himself after its central figure. His courtesy name was Moji, taken directly from Weimoji, the Chinese rendering of Vimalakirti. Wang Wei, one of the most celebrated poets in Chinese literary history, chose to carry this householder's name through his life. A poet who lived among mountains and wrote about solitude and nature, yes, but a layman. A man in the world, named after the man who walked through taverns and held a universe like a piece of fruit. In Japan, the text became one of the 3 stras that the figure of Prince Shotoku in the 7th century is said to have commented on personally. It appears in the murals of the Dunhuang cave temples, the great complex of decorated caves carved into the cliffs of northwest China, which preserved centuries of Buddhist art through conditions that preserved almost nothing else. The debate between Vimalakirti and Mañjuśrī, the moment just before the silence, was one of the most frequently painted scenes. Artists returned to it again and again. Something in that image, the 2 figures, one about to speak and one about to not speak, would not let go of the imagination. For most of the centuries since its composition, the original Sanskrit was thought to be lost. The Chinese and Tibetan translations survived, the Sanskrit did not, or so it seemed. Then, in 1999, a scholar named Takahashi Hisao was working in the Potala Palace in Lhasa, the great fortress palace that sits above the city of Lhasa in Tibet, and he found it. A Sanskrit manuscript of the Vimalakīrti Nirdeśa Sūtra. Not lost, hidden, or simply waiting, in the way that things wait in old palaces in high mountains. The manuscript was published in the years that followed, and scholars who had been working only with translations had, for the first time in roughly 2 millennia, the original to work from. In the English-speaking world, in the United States, 2 translations in particular became the ones people actually read. Robert Thurman's version in 1976, translated from the Tibetan, brought the text to readers who had no other way to reach it. And Burton Watson's version in 1997, published by Columbia University Press and translated from Kumārajīva's Chinese, became the one many people who love the text carry with them. Watson's is clean, direct, shaped by a translator's ear for how a sentence should feel when read aloud. Reading Thurman or Watson in bed, in a quiet room, in a year much later than the 1st century of the Common Era, you are reading something that travelled from India through Central Asia to China to Japan, that was painted on cave walls and debated in courts, and carried in the hands of poets who named themselves after its central figure. You are quite late in that journey, and the journey is still going. Because here you are. Take a slow, slow breath. Let your body become a little heavier if it wants to. Let the places where you are holding yourself release, just slightly if they will. We have been in this room for a long time tonight. The crowd on the thrones, the goddess with her flowers, the body swap, the bowl that did not empty, the 31 answers, the one non-answer that was praised above all the others, and underneath all of it, the thing the straw has been saying from the first page, in every chapter, in every episode, in every refusal and every miracle and every moment of gentle comedic reversal, is this: the one who understood most in the room was someone who had not renounced anything. He had a wife. He had a family. He had a house in a real city. He had servants and a fortune and a history of walking into the places where ordinary people in difficulty spend their time. He was sick. The sickness was not incidental to his wisdom and not an obstacle to it. In his own account, the sickness was an expression of it, because he had not drawn a line around himself that excluded the world's suffering. The suffering of all sentient beings was his suffering, and when they would be free of it, he would be free of it. He never left ordinary life, he went deeper into it. That is the text. That is what it says. Not as a metaphor for something else, not as a concession or an accommodation for people who couldn't manage the real thing. As its central claim, the one who held a universe in his palm like a piece of fruit, the one who sat in a room that held 32,000 impossible thrones, the one who answered the highest question with the deepest silence, that person had a house, had a life inside the ordinary world, had obligations and relationships, and an illness he couldn't get out of bed from. If you are lying in bed right now because you are tired, because the day was long, because you have things to do tomorrow that you will have to find some way of doing, because the life you are living is in some ways heavy and in other ways rich, and in most ways simply relentlessly ordinary, this straw was written for you. Not for someone else who has fewer obligations, more time, a quieter mind, for you. The text said so. It said so by making its central figure a person who looks like you more than he looks like anyone in the robes seated on the thrones. You do not need to remember the names. You do not need to carry the philosophy. You do not need to have understood the silence in any way that you can explain. If one thing stays from this evening, let it be that the one who understood most never left ordinary life. That is not a concession the tradition made reluctantly. That is the sutra's own claim, plainly stated. The bodhisattva of wisdom walked through the door of a householder and was not the smartest person in the room. And the room held everyone. Let the room hold you now. You have been listening for a long time, and the listening itself has been doing something, even if you cannot say what, even if you are already mostly asleep, even if the words are dissolving into the quiet, the way the scent from a land of fragrances might drift into a room and then dissipate and leave only the memory that it was there, that it came, and it was enough, and it asked nothing of you in return. We have walked through a lot of rooms tonight. The Mrapple garden where the Buddha waited, the threshold at which each great disciple paused, remembered, and declined. The house in Vale, emptied of furniture, one couch, one man on it, sick on purpose, waiting. The room that held 32,000 thrones and did not grow. The goddess with her flowers, the body that held one awareness, and then another, and then proved by doing so that neither was the awareness. The bowl that did not empty. The 31 voices naming what they had understood, and then the one voice that had no answer. Which was the best answer? We have been in the Potala Palace, late in a year when a scholar found something that had been waiting a very long time to be found again. We have been with Wang Wei, who named himself Moji, walking in his mountains with the householder's name in his mouth. We have been with Kumārajīva in 406, making a translation so alive that it outlasted almost everything else from that year by 1,500 years and more. We have been with the people who read Thurman's translation in 1976 and Watson's in 1997, lying somewhere the way you are lying now, in an ordinary room in an ordinary life, reaching towards something that this text reached back at them. And now it is late. You do not need to remember any of it. If one moment stayed, let that be enough. If the image of a room that could hold more than a room should hold has settled somewhere in you, let it rest there gently. If the image of a man on a couch, too sick to move, who was also the wisest person in an assembly of the wisest beings in the cosmos, if that image is resting somewhere in your chest right now, let it stay without you examining it. It will do whatever it does while you sleep. The deepest answer in the straw was silence, so let us end in silence, approaching it slowly. The room in Vale is still holding everyone. The thrones that should not have fit are still there. The food that should not have been enough was enough. The flowers that stuck did not come off because they were not meant to come off. Not yet, not through trying, only through the loosening that comes in its own time, the way everything real comes in its own time. The man on the couch has said what he had to say. He said it without saying anything. And somewhere in you tonight, something knows what he meant. Not because you are extraordinary. Not because you have earned it, but because you are ordinary in exactly the right way, the way Vimalakīrti was ordinary, which is to say, inside a life, all the way inside it, not holding yourself at the edge of it, so you will be clean enough, ready enough, free enough to deserve what you are looking for. You are already in the life. That was never the wall. That was always the door. Welcome to Relaxing Subjects. Thank you for being here tonight. Subject closed for the night. Let it all relax away.